Really nice to be here, back here. It's very comfortable, welcoming place. So I hope you're all having a great time. Yeah, let me know.
I jacked that up.
I think this is the first time I've used a microphone here, so tell me if it's helping or if I need to change it. So anyway, I went to school, to college in the 70s, and I was sort of trained in what I call late modernism, from which I have been sort of reacting, responding, recovering, sort of thinking myself ever since. So I'd say I'm a very visual artist first, in that my work is very much about visual experience. It's very much about form and material. I've always, since school, thought of myself as a sculptor, which I don't think really is an important distinction, but I enjoy playing with the idea of it in terms of its kind of conventional definition in relation to painting. But I'm really in a very kind of fluid, slippery place between the dimensions and the categories. Um, in the early 90s, I started using materials that were familiar materials that had all kinds of other uses and that I felt carried both sort of formal, abstract characteristics into my work as well as references to either the human body, to other parts of life. So a simple sculpture with a draped piece of fabric uh, and made out of shelving posts and upholstery fabric with a strung plastic beads along the bottom could sort of function as both line and decoration and a kind of sensuous, even gender implying element. So I was really interested always and still in creating relationships between things which may or may not seem to belong together and which don't always make sense, and to enjoy the humor in that, the surprise in that. Um, I think of myself as a sculptor and installation artist. So if you think of like the previous piece, that exists in relation to floors and walls and an interior. This exists in relation to the green grass, the larger tree that was near it. And these are from the early 90s. I was just finding materials, altering them, stuffing them. This is about my height and clearly has a figurative, in my mind, sort of implication. And often selecting things that I thought were really ugly or homely without any real sort of aesthetic, conventional aesthetic appeal, and then changing them in some way and entering into a conversation about what makes something beautiful or not beautiful or comfortable or uncomfortable. So sewing elastic into pieces of fabric was suddenly this obsession that I had because it transfers a flat thing into a dimensional thing. It carries every little bit of information that's in there is in some way known to us and in some way strange. So that it might look like underwear. It might look like something that's inside out. It might look like intestines, all through this kind of bizarrely simple and useless process. Fitted sheets, fitted sheet, blue fitted sheet, and strung glass beads that kind of pull the color down. There is a kind of painting reference in there, just in the gravity and the dripping quality, the liquidity of it. This piece was made in the mid-90s with a fitted sheet and light blue recycling plastic sewn into it. And when I look at it now, I think of the AIDS moment that we were living with at that time, and this preoccupation with protection and health and illness and danger. And the fitted sheet happened to have been a kind of weird source of inspiration for me because it's a form with no name, something you can't really fold very well. It's just this sort of thing that we all know about. And, when I fold my fitted sheets, I just stuff them into the drawer really fast so that nobody will see what they look like. So I've kind of used that as inspiration there. Taste is something I'm really interested in. Where does it come from? Why do we feel governed by it? What does it tell us about, class and culture and environment? Bear in mind, so here, this was for a bathroom, obviously, but it was a show in a bathroom. And I just went out and collected as many blue shower curtains from, a five and dime type of store, 99-cent store. Really tacky, but I thought really beautiful as well. And I was also playing around with decor because I was able to pick towels and toilet paper and soap dish for this. Bear in mind that, I just got a whole bunch of new images, so I'm excited. I put them on I sort of backloaded this with them. Every time that happens, I have to take something out. So the story just keeps changing. It's really hard to edit. It's really hard to know what to take out. So we'll see, what picture you get from this. Hopefully you won't, I could try to go through it pretty quickly. But another shower curtain piece, you can see it's got a color scheme and also kind of figurative. Figurative on a much larger scale. These are some chenille bedspreads that my parents had in a crate. They hated them. They weren't into that kind of thing. They were more interested in earthy woolen things that came from South America. So nobody cared that I took these, and it was all about excess, all about the decorative, the just over the top. It's about 13 feet high. And so I've kind of gravitated between these extremes of excess and a kind of like stark abjection in my pieces. And in this piece, I stapled this to the wall after having used push pins and any number of other things to attach something to a wall. I was just really dissatisfied with them, and so I thought, I'm going to staple this. And then I just kept going. I couldn't stop. And that brought me to a whole new body of work, which, if you know my work at all, is probably what you've seen reproduced. So I did about a 10-year body of work using staples, and this piece just evolved in a gallery, in a corner, me fighting it out with the material until I arrived at a form that I thought was interesting. But in the course of that, you see the residue of all of the stapling, because really that's all that's holding that form there, and all that's creating both the volume and the tension is the tension of those staples. But the bonus is all this weird drawing that's around it, and this sort of trace of what happened before. Right here in this same period, I'm sort of throwing in some site-specific installations, which are some of the most fun things I do, where I, really just have a couple of days to come up with an idea and install it. And this was a derelict building, and you could look inside to this bathroom through an open skylight, and the dirt could kind of go in. So it was like a funnel into the toilet. And at this time, the late 90s, there was a lot of exhibition making in spaces that were about to be renovated. For one reason or another, this was at an art fair that was kind of a collaboration between the real estate industry and an arts organization. So it was an empty office building. The owners were looking for new tenants or whatever. So we were invited to come in and make pieces or show artwork. So my interest would always be to make something with what's there. And here is a kind of almost interior earthwork or landscape. Um, that led into a piece that was on a much larger scale, but really these are the first things I ever did using carpet, and primarily commercial office carpet that I would get in remnants, but then other carpets that I collected. And I'd been invited to make this piece at a gallery at Wesleyan University, which was a vast space, about 75 feet long, with 28-foot ceilings, and it at the time had a yellow carpet. What you see on the left, it was the gallery carpet, which I just thought was so ridiculous and ugly and inhospitable to artwork, that I thought, well, I have to make that the subject of this work, you know. So I kind of spent a year collecting things and really was trying to evoke like painting, landscape, display, like what you might see in a store window, um, painting here, you know, with this kind of edge, playing with the idea of the edge, and storage, and maybe a kind of reverence toward the carpet as a precious collectible object. Anyway, it was really fun. Then we gave all this carpet away to students and faculty, at least as much of it as we could, except for the things I really wanted. But I did save a couple, and you'll see them come back, or one of them come back. So in the meantime, I had started making these pieces by stapling fabric to the wall, and then I wanted to be able to show some of it. So rather than trying to reproduce the work in the gallery, I started making myself panels where I would layer drywall on top of plywood and then staple something to it, and I could work on it for as long as I wanted to, and basically use the staple as kind of an analog to the stitch, so that I would sort of staple along the pattern of the weave in the fabric, in this case chenille curtains, and then you'd have this very binary language of staple and fabric. And then I would take a lot of it out, and you'd have all of the abrasion of the drywall or whatever was going on that surface. So you get paper and plaster and little holes. And, you know, I was just kind of going down this little rabbit hole of trying this, curious, what would happen next? But it brought me into this arena of painting that I really had not been in since I was an undergrad, and that I really didn't feel there was a place for me in. And suddenly here I was confronted with these large bedspread that's about the size of a large painting. And again, using the pattern as the basis for my strategic sort of act of stapling and composing, and getting involved with figure and ground and issues that I associate with painting, that I enjoy working with, but had really never found a way into in a way that seemed meaningful to me. This is another same bedspread, you know, another one just like it that I made more as a site-specific piece for this particular space, where I broke it up into sections and kind of had it move through the space. So each one is really initiated by whatever pattern there is there, and then resolves itself in a way that is pretty much formal in my, you know, meaning that I start with a strategy, but it's not a rule. So there's no end that's like prescribed at the beginning. It's really just start and then deal. And I think of them each, you know, I have my little private names for them that are homages to different painters that they make me think of. And when I install them flush with the wall around them. So I build them into the wall, or I build a wall for them, and I plaster them in, so that really the beginning and end of them becomes ambiguous. They become continuous with the wall around them, and they activate this surface in a way that is somewhere in between them sinking into the wall and emerging from the wall. So I did this. In 2009, I had a survey show where a lot of these were shown together. And whoops. So that's just one instance of how that looks, as well as quite a number of other pieces shown in this museum. And then jumping back, 2003 and 3 through 5, I evolved this project that I called Civilization and Its Discontents. I'd been kind of mulling over this idea of using some very, very worn Middle Eastern carpets that my parents had, that I knew so intimately from staring at them for my entire life, but that were almost worn and no longer on the floors because nobody could, they were useless. And I thought that would be an interesting thing to try. And then in 2003, when the U.S. was launching the invasion in Iraq, I was really preoccupied with that, and suddenly they came together in my mind as a way to express loss, and frustration, and sense of helplessness in the face of global tragedy. And I started to understand how these materials really are part not just of a global tragedy, but of a global industry that's thousands of years old, that is in some ways culturally specific, but that in some ways is also part of global trade and a network of labor and commerce that the textile industry is almost emblematic of. So I had been invited to, I'd first done a small version of this at Smack Melon, which is a nonprofit in Brooklyn. And then I was invited to make a project at the University at Cornell in Ithaca called the Johnson Museum. And so I wanted to do this on a large scale. They wanted me to go and sort of infiltrate the collection. And it was really interesting to set it up against a museum collection, which is all about value and protecting value, and really whatever has gone in historically to acquisition, which is politically complicated and involves power and at times exploitation and conquest. And as an artist actually working in this space, I'm just trying to see whether I left that already. What I did was I installed a kind of salon style show of these panels, and then I went into the other rooms and distributed some of the scrap and all this other stuff. But while I was working, because this took a couple of weeks to do, to install these panels that were already made, I had guards watching me most of the time. I had to check my bags when I walked in and out of the museum. I'm not check them, but have them inspected. And I was very, very conscious of that relationship, that I was really a kind of a pest. I was not the focus of what the museum was about. The museum was really not about contemporary art and not about artists who are alive or working. So that was also really seemed to feed into that whole project, because my pieces are so much about their own ephemerality, or the appearance of ephemerality, and their almost lack of collectability or conservability. And so to be placed in that situation, setting them up against medieval objects that were being cared for so carefully, really, I felt, inflected the whole thing. Another piece from around the same time is in the basement of the Sculpture Center, also an institution in New York City, in Queens, where I, for the first time, built my own walls to alter space. So I kind of redefined site specificity for myself as that it was okay for me to do that. And I've realized, throughout my entire life that I carry so many unconscious rules in my head, which I imagine you all may too. Um, and there are moments when suddenly those become apparent, where I become aware of them, and I find myself able to move on. Another project at the Aldrich Museum, a New Englandy museum, where I felt that this white on white kind of colonial style of chenille bedspread was what I wanted. This shows you a bit about the process of installing this piece. So that was a 3-panel piece. Those are 3 4x8 sheets of material. And we built a sort of slightly angled wall there. You see the panels get put up, sheetrock gets slapped around them, and then it gets taped and painted and ends up looking, like it was always there. This, on the other hand, is a temporary piece made in a few days with miscellaneous materials, not really organized around the rectangle or the grid in the same cohesive way, but nevertheless, inevitably doing that. Pieces made, another piece at Smackmelon. You can see I made things out of the gallery and then brought them in and built them into larger structures. This was made in North Carolina as part of a group show that accompanied a symposium about industry in the Carolinas and in the South, because so much of it was being outsourced. This is in 2008. And at this point, I made this piece with students using materials that are attached to the wall, because partly because they didn't want me to mess up the wall, and using materials from some of these very stores that are contributing so much to the problems of globalization. But it was a moment where I started actually researching the textile industry, because my use of fabric up until that time was completely intuitive. I was very interested in associations and psychology and draping, and so it's the sort of sensuous and erotic potential of a lot of these fabrics, and the domestic connotations, but I didn't really know a whole lot about textile history, the history of labor, technology, the environment as affected, blah, blah, blah. So I started actually learning. And here, another piece made for the Drawing Center, where I was really interested in negative space and scale. I love that fly. So this is just comprised of, rectangular wedges that I made. Rectangles. Not rectangles, triangles. And that I set up next to one another. It's very mossy, kind of organic, but at the same time very geometric. Another piece that followed it. And here I made another leap, where I started, rather than taking a piece of fabric and taking it apart, I was actually looking into my bags of scrap and drawing with the fabric. So doing this was a sort of a moment that led to other new moments. So color became line, line became color. It's very much about this relationship between what we know is a precise level line and then the irregularity of the staple. And that relationship kind of in my head that I've always had and been interested in, the sort of the mark of the hand, the limitations of the body in relation to geometry. This is a child's jacket that I stapled. I didn't use it all up. I wished I could have, but I had these 3 lines to staple, and but you can see that, you can, well, you can recognize, say, a pocket here. And I just really liked the way that all the different parts of the jacket contributed to the range of colors. And it was just kind of teased out of itself by the process. And it became a scene. So from there, I went on to do a series of pieces where I was drawing. So I was essentially composing this, and rather than deconstructing, I was making. This was from an actual curated group show where there were people's work kind of overlapping one another. So there's another artist, Polly Applebaum's framed work on top of my work. And this cube was actually part of the exhibition design. So there were a variety of cubes in the gallery. This was at the Tang Museum, which is in Saratoga Springs. So you can see other cubes there. And I followed that up with, a show that was inspired by it, freestanding, no longer using drywall here because drywall is too weak to really withstand a lot of handling, and suddenly became an opportunity. It introduced color, it introduced shape, it introduced material. I went back to these shelving posts that I've known for so long. I did staple in these walls, but I wanted this to have a kind of modern landscape, billboard, scaffolding kind, signpost, easel. I wanted all these references, clothesline. So in some ways, you can see that what's happening is that I'm struggling with my dependence on the wall in this work that I've been making, because it's very limiting in some ways. It's technically limiting, formally limiting, financially limiting. It's not something that a person really wants to be doing by themselves. And, hauling sheetrock, installing this stuff. So I was trying to free myself, and have ever since, really, for the last 10 years, almost 10 years, been trying a lot of different strategies to do that. And while going back to the stapling again and again, when I have a chance to, when somebody else invites me to, or when I feel strongly that it needs to be there. This piece was from 2012, and I had been invited to provide a floor for a group show that was celebrating or whatever, responding to Sigmund Freud's office in Vienna, which was famously covered in Persian carpets, and also full of, just like this menagerie of stuff that he had collected, because he was an obsessive collector. So I reached out to a variety of people to see if I could get some donations of carpet, and I made contact with a carpet dealer, an Armenian carpet dealer who had carpets that he had been using to repair other carpets with. So he'd cut out little bits of them, the good parts, repair other carpets with them. And so he had these hacked up carpets. So I was just in heaven. And I made this big piece. And underneath it, in this central area, you see this 70s shag carpet that I had saved from 10 years, well, more than 15 years previously, in the Wesleyan piece. But, I was kind of involved in this, this kind of collaging at this point, overlapping of images that you could see through one another. You've got the grid here that I feel references, the modernist grid, modernist painting, but then you have this amazing, richness of organic, floral, natural imagery, symbolic imagery. This piece I started while I was at the Albers Foundation. It's the piece that was at the boiler, which is about 40 feet high. So the piece itself is about 20 feet high. It's probably like the biggest thing I've engineered and produced by myself. It has 2 sections. One of them is made in the way I described, with the layer of plywood under the drywall, and then has this hand linoleum printed sheer curtain fabric on top of it, stapled onto it. And then the other side was made with all of this scrap plywood and cabinet lumber that I'd collected in various places, including at the foundation. And for me, this piece, it does sort of nod to both Joseph and Annie Albers and the Bauhaus, and that aesthetic and that interest in the grid. This is just to sort of give you an idea of how it went in. Oh, so many pictures. That's me for scale. I went on to make, yet another iteration where I had found some flooring material and had this space in Poughkeepsie, in Peekskill, with a little wood stove with no stack, just sitting in the middle of a room, a warehouse. So I thought, okay, this is my room. And I kind of interwove, I added this layer of flooring on top of the fabric as opposed to beneath it. I sort of wove it in and out. And then, right in that same period, I was invited to go to Sharjah in the UAE and made something related there where there was some stapling. There I had access to like new materials bought at a mall, as well as my carpets that were actually old carpets that I sent over there in some tubs, plastic tubs. We went to the mall, we bought some new stuff, we integrated them. You can see this sort of weird digitalized carpet. I was introduced to a new country, a new everything. That's me and the Sheikh of Sharjah. And there's one little section I had stapled up there like a postage stamp, and then that was the pallet that the stuff had been shipped on. Those scraps were not on it, just tubs, plastic tubs, but that was the pallet, and it became an element in the piece here for the first time, a detail. Now that's a piece. This is a picture of it taken in my studio. It's been kind of rearranged a few times, but it sort of entered into a new realm. And this is a show that I did in 2015, at the end of 2015, where I was using logs that I had started using and stapling the logs. But I had also made a piece here with another jacket where I determined in advance I'm going to make these lines in the room and seams kind of, and I'm going to use the entire jacket. It's going to be gone. So basically that's what I've done here. So all of the lining, everything is stuffed into these walls or hanging off of them. And then in the center of the room was this long piece of fallen logs that I had attached various pieces of fabric to. And going back from having kind of dematerialized an object and now reintroducing an object as a sort of quote, sculpture in quotes, to make a sculpture. One thing that I like about these objects is that they don't necessarily have to be set in one way. They can be handled. They're sort of like the surrealist object in some way. They're not oriented in the way that a painting or a sculpture on a base is. Now this, of course, is more oriented. There's a string attaching that to the ceiling that you can't probably see very well. It's made using some shipping crates that I have around. I can't stand having these crates around. So I just thought, okay, can throw them away, or I can make them talk to this other wood. The woods could talk. Um, so I'm kind of involved with this now. I've had to put it on hold, that particular project on hold. When I was in Norway in the summer, and while most of what I made is work that I was able to bring back with me, that was my goal. I did make one log that I tied to this two walls and left behind. Whoops. Now here's a bunch of my paper pieces. I've done worked at Dudonné Paper, which is a paper mill that works with artists. They make the pulp, or you can make your own pulp, but they provide pulp. I had a residency there in 2008, but since that time, I've gone back a lot. I became hooked. So these are about 22 by 28 inches or so. I just play with this material and see what happens. I've been kind of preoccupied with also, in some ways, dematerializing this so that there's really no structural integrity to what's in front of you. Not so much dematerializing it, but somehow just undermining its structural integrity. But I've also just really enjoyed, I've been laying rubber car mats onto the pulp before I put them in the press. So you get these surfaces that are embossed. And, referencing a weave structure, a grill, louvers, but basically just it's sort of very immediately gratifying process. Very much about color, surface, tactility. So I had to throw them in somewhere. I didn't know where, so I stuck them there. And then I have now launched into this funny little sampler project, I call it, where I've been weaving pieces of textiles together by hand, by basically taking two pieces of fabric, cutting them, two pieces of almost identical fabric. I try to line it up, two pieces up that are identical. It's quite hard to do, but cutting them in two directions, weaving them together, and then seeing how they invariably shift, and you get this kind of offset pattern because of the matter, right? There's just like too much stuff there. You have double the stuff, and you're trying to fit it into that space. So it forces itself out of alignment. And these are about, I'd say, 14, 16 inches square. And then this is another piece that I made in Norway using materials that I found locally and some that I brought. And so I remember I said I wanted to be able to bring this stuff home. So I just tried some totally uncharacteristic strategies. And then I just came back from the Republic of Georgia, the city of Tbilisi, where I participated in an exhibition that was, wonderful experience to be in this country. They have they're on the Silk Road. They're in the Caucasus next to Azerbaijan and Armenia. So serious trade route, serious textile traditions. And this gallery that the show was in, if you look closely, you'll see that there are two different patterns in the floor. So there was clearly a wall somewhere in there. And the building was at one time a trading post, so it's undergone a lot of transition. Now it's a history museum. So I just wanted to play with the traces of that. So I brought carpet, and then I went out and I worked with some students. We only had 3.5 days to actually produce this piece. So they were, invaluable to me, and I could have worked on this for another week quite easily. I think this might be, oh yeah, that's just sort of a larger installation shot of the room. And that's it. Thank you.